Hello, EduMagicians. Welcome to the EduMagic podcast with your host, Dr. Sam Fessich. Dr. Sam is a professor of education, author of EduMagic, and a pumpkin spice latte fan. This podcast is designed for pre-service teachers. Remember, friends, teaching doesn't begin at graduation, but during that first class at 8 a.m. Let's get this party started.
I'm Matt Miller of the Ditch That Textbook podcast, a proud member of the Education Podcast Network, just like the show you're listening to right now. The opinions expressed are those of the individual hosts. Make sure you check out all the other great educational podcasts at edupodcastnetwork.com.
Hello, EduMagicians, and welcome to another episode of the EduMagic podcast. I am so excited to have the Rachelle Poth on the show today. Rachelle is a rock star in all things education. She has 2 books out. She's the president of iSTETEN. She's a rock star teacher, and among lots of other things. Rachelle, welcome to the show. I'm so excited to have you on.
Thank you for having me. And that intro was like, I need to get that on record so I can play that when I arrive at places, I think. That was awesome. So
I love it.
You're too kind.
I'll put some intro music to it so, whenever the fog machine goes and the glitter cannons, you can just own the stage.
If that would ever happen, oh my.
Oh, that'd be kind of fun. Anywho, thank you so much for being on the show today. This is the EduMagic podcast, one for pre-service teachers and designed specifically for those future teachers in mind. So a great way to get us thinking about education is talking about our teaching story. And as you know, everyone has a teaching story, from pre-service teacher, freshman, to student teacher, to first-year educator. Rachelle, can you please share your teaching story and what got you into the world of education?
It's funny when I get asked this question because I think it surprises people a lot, when you are so involved in teaching and education, and like that's all that you tend to do in your time, whether it's like in the evening or on the weekends. Like people just, I think sometimes assume that like, oh, you must have always wanted to be a teacher, like from the time you were a kid. And I really didn't, at least not as like a conscious, like, oh yeah, when I grow up, I want to be a teacher. I know when I was a kid, I loved to play school. I was the teacher and the student because I was an only child. So like my thing was playing school. I came from a family that had different educators and some who were like school psychologists. So there was like that element into my life where like there were teachers, and then my parents brought me up, to value education. And growing up in the, late 70s, 80s, we didn't have a lot of the technology tools and things going. So you really did have to focus. So I did love learning, but I didn't really know that I wanted to be a teacher. And it wasn't until my junior year at Penn State, after I think 2.5 years of trying to figure out exactly what I wanted to do, where we had the serious conversation like, okay, now's the time for you to decide, what are you going to do? And we looked at options, and I always liked helping people. I did tutor in high school and then earlier on in college. And it was just a suggestion, why don't you try teaching? And so I took the coursework, did all the, student teaching and the different experiences like that. And I really enjoyed it. But even then, I didn't necessarily know that it was something that I could see myself doing, for the next 30 years. Mm-hmm. But over the past 10 or so years, I've really come back from a point where I felt maybe a little bit disengaged because I wasn't finding the right opportunities to kind of grow myself professionally and personally. But then I've come back into it. And so now it's like, I love teaching, but it's been this ongoing transition throughout my whole life. So maybe the signs were there when I was a kid and I just didn't realize it. But yeah, so that's how I ended up here.
Well, that's a great story. And you talked about going to Penn State. Did you student teach through Penn State's program?
I did. And I was fortunate that I was able to student teach near where I live here in Pennsylvania in McKeesport area. I did a couple observations, mm-hmm. but I was placed in Gateway School District, which is only like 15 minutes from my house. It was really nice although I did miss being at Penn State at the campus, but it was nice to finish that up and be in a close school, because then once I graduated, I had those opportunities where I could go back and substitute.
Oh, I love that. That is such a blessing to be able to go student teach where you're from, and then you get those homegrown connections to educators and administrators from that district. Thanks so much. That's a great strategy, and I'm glad that you were able to do that. I too went to Penn State, but I didn't go for my undergrad. So fun fact, we have another connection there besides iSTETEN and
I
Twitter
did
and all
not
those
know
things.
that. Right.
Yeah.
That's why you need to connect, because then you find out all of these interesting things.
Yes, yes. All right. So thinking back to your college days at Penn State, whether you were student teaching or doing a field experience, can you share one of your favorite or most memorable, most impactful teaching moments from that time?
Oh my gosh, that's going back a ways. Really, like, some days I'm like, did I even student teach? No, I think there are two that come to mind really quickly. And one, it was in an elementary school, kind of between Altoona and Penn State, very small school. But I knew from the beginning, like, just because I was majoring in French, that I would likely teach, high school or middle school.
Mm-hmm.
And I was placed into a third grade classroom, and before I even got there, I was like, oh my gosh, I don't know. Am I going to like this? I had no idea, because my whole perception was I'm going to be a high school teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember just going in the first day, and the students were just so excited that they were going to have this new teacher coming in. And I was able to take over the class and just learn a lot of things from the kids. And it was just it made me excited to be there, and it showed value in what I had been learning. Plus, it also opened my mind a little bit more to well, maybe I would like being, an elementary teacher, not just high school. So it definitely broadened my perspective and changed my mind. And it was a lot of fun. So that's the first one. And then the second one was when I actually did my student teaching at Gateway. It's kind of funny. It's not so much not like back then, but some of the students that I had were kind of they were tough, great personalities, very funny. I really enjoyed being there and working with my cooperating teacher, and that experience was great. And then it was kind of funny, 10 years ago, you leave and you have these connections and you make these connections with the students. And I wasn't that much older than some of them. So that was what was interesting to me, is I was 21 years old, I think, at the time, if not 22 maybe. And I had students who were 18. So that was so different than what I was used to. But I remember about 10 years ago now going to a fundraising event, and my best friend from high school was there, and she had a couple friends with her. And I'm looking at this girl and I'm like, she reminds me of somebody. And I couldn't think of who it was. And then it occurred to me, and she said to me, "Are you Miss Berquist?" And I went, "What?" And she was a student that I had when she was in 10th grade all those years ago. And she's now like a best friend with my other friend. And so it was really neat to hear her perspective and tell me oh, I remember you did this in the classroom, that, and things that I had forgotten. So it's nice to kind of circle back around, because you never know whenever you're in the classroom, for 1 year, if you're student teaching or if you're just observing once a week or whatever, what kind of an impact you might make on one student or all the students. The smallest interactions can make such an impact, and you may never know. But then when you have this opportunity 15 years later and you don't even realize, and then you hear back what you did made a difference for a student, it's amazing.
It really is amazing. You're so right. Even as a student teacher and field student, you are making an impact in students' lives. You may not be their full-time teacher, but you are a teacher in their classroom, and you do make a difference and you do make an impact. That's a great message for this audience to hear, because sometimes we feel we go into classrooms, I'm only there for 5 hours or 8-hour observation. What can I do in that time? You can do a lot. You really can.
Right. Absolutely.
Now, you said you student taught in a high school?
Yes.
Now, I know for it could be a little different in elementary to high school, but with how did you make yourself stand out as an educator, as a young professional in a high school setting where you're a place for student teaching? Because as you said, the students were 17, 18, you were 21, 22, not much of an age difference there, but how could you make yourself stand out as a student teacher or as a field student in a high school placement?
It can be a challenge, just because there's that proximity in age. And if you go, and I know for years I worked as a waitress in a restaurant, and I was working with students, or, high school students, and we were friends, but we were working in this different space. But whenever you come into the classroom, I was fortunate as well, because the teacher who was my co-op had everything kind of set up as far as the structure and those interactions. And I really started to just kind of initially model after her to see, what are the lines that are drawn? What are the connections between students and teachers? And you have to be strong and set yourself apart as the educator, But you also have to make sure that, and I didn't know this back then, so me telling you this now is not like, oh, I did this. I mean, this is years in reflecting and, learning as you go. But you really do have to have a part of you that does connect with students, and you build those relationships, because that's important. But it is a fine line to kind of figure out your way around. I found that it was a little bit more difficult when I started teaching my full-time job. I have no idea why. And perhaps it was just because that was the first time I didn't have somebody to kind of model after, because for 3 years I did substitute teach in different schools. And so it was just me and trying to figure out my own, using my own prior experience as a student teacher, trying to be myself, which I'd like to talk to people and I like those conversations and those interactions, but yet trying to keep the way that I had been taught, where there was not so much of an interaction between teachers and students. So trying to figure it all out. Knowing what I know today, if I could go back and rewind, I would definitely, you have to start with the relationships, but have your mind set upon like, what is a comfortable space? Like, what do you hope that students would expect in terms of like approachability to you? Because you want to be approachable, right. But you also have to set your presence as a teacher, because it's your classroom, and to keep all those things managed as well, and respect. We could talk forever about that, but knowing who you are, knowing what you want to do for the students, and figuring out the best way to set a boundary that works for you and for them, I think is key.
I think that's a great piece of advice for the students to think through as they go through student teaching or fieldwork, being able to set those boundaries, set yourself apart as a professional in the classroom, but also being able to build those relationships, because that's key when it comes to teaching. You have to build those relationships with students.
Definitely.
So whenever we talk about EduMagic, are there any areas that you'd like to focus on regarding EduMagic that can help the listeners today?
Well, I could turn this on you and say, which areas would you like? No, but I have in mind what I would share, but I'll just ask you, what is one area that you think that, there needs to be more information about, or that there's a message that, needs to be shared with pre-service teachers?
I would have to say getting out of the classroom. So getting out of your college class and going out there to professional development opportunities, or participating in a Twitter chat, getting out of your comfort zone and attending and presenting at conferences. So I think that's a message that needs to get out there. Oftentimes, I think future teachers feel, well, I don't have 3 days, 3 weeks, let alone 3 years of experience. Nobody cares what I have to say. And as we know, that couldn't be more wrong. Student teachers and pre-service teachers really have a voice in the field of education. And I think a way to bolster that voice is by getting out there.
Well, I'm glad you picked that one, because I think that is another thing, that things I wish I knew when. I taught in isolation for years, and in some points it was a matter of survival for me, because I was struggling with classroom management and some discipline, and just kind of figuring out how to balance everything that we need to do. And so I kept to myself, and that is like the worst thing that you can do, because you just sit there and you think that you're the only person, or you might think you're the only person who's experiencing those struggles. Or for me, in some cases, like it shows vulnerability, because if you admit like, hey, I'm having these problems, then you get this perception that others might think that you're not qualified. And that's completely like, even though we're the teacher, even though we're in the front of the room or on the side of the room, wherever we are, we're not experts. We can't be nice, but we're not.
Right.
And the only way that we can do our best for students is we have to keep pushing ourselves. And if I only teach the content that I know, I'm totally limiting them to where they can go beyond that. And so you're absolutely right. Like getting out and finding the time. In the past, it was a challenge, because you had to physically go somewhere and to meet people, or, get together at a conference. But now there are all these other ways that you can connect and learn on your schedule. So whether you're like, oh, I'm going to go for a walk, listen to the EduMagic podcast, get on Twitter, all of these different opportunities to learn, just to keep building your skills. And that's when you realize like, hey, there are other people who are having the same struggles as me. Or you might just find, and even if your message that you share just reaches one person, once you've gotten out there, like that one person might be the one who needed it the most. And then it just continues. And so, you have to make that time because it's as important for us to learn and grow as it is for our students. And with all the many ways to do that now, I think like just pick one. It doesn't have to be all of them. Just pick one and add one at a different time whenever you have more time available.
Yeah, I love that. So find one that speaks to you and the way that you learn and can get out there best, and then add to it as you get more comfortable and your time becomes more valuable to you to get out there and grow as an educator, because you'll never be an expert. And that's the beauty of being a teacher. You're always learning. Do you have any favorite Twitter chats that you would recommend that future teachers join and have their voice be heard on there and get ideas and grow as educators?
There are a ton of great chats out there, and it's so hard to pick just one. I know on Saturday mornings, the one I really like is EduGladiators, because we have a theme each month, and every week there's a different topic in that theme. So you get so many different educators from around the world with different roles and levels of experience. So that's a great one on Saturday mornings. Friday nights, Engage Chat is another one that always has great topics. I'm going backwards, I noticed. Mastery Chat from the Teach Better team is another one. I mean, it depends on what you're looking for. So I know on Monday nights, I co-host Formative Chat, and our topics are always around assessment, but not necessarily like tools, but we've been talking about things like social emotional learning, getting to know your students, back to school ideas, reflective practice, all of these other topics that are important. So I think finding a chat that is not necessarily like just one focus, but has different diverse topics are really good ideas just to start. I know like Learn Like a Pirate, like Monday night has great chats lined up. And don't feel like when you get into a chat that you have to answer every question or to stay the whole time. That's the beauty of it, is like you can just scroll through and look at some of the answers, and there's your PD. There's a way to connect. You know, somebody posted a resource that you like respond to them, start a conversation, just see what other hashtags they use, depending on your area too. I mean, there's social studies, elementary, if you're deciding like, hey, I want to be a coach, all of these different hashtags that you can use too, besides just the Twitter chats.
Exactly. I think finding chats that speak to you as a teacher and that's going to help you grow is so important, because you can connect with other educators, you can build your PLN and learn from a lot of different perspectives when it comes to a Twitter chat.
Definitely. Things I wish I knew years ago.
I know, right? And it's great.
Yeah.
They're getting the inside scoop now.
Yes.
So another great way to grow and learn is through your professional reading. And I know that you have 2 amazing books out. Would you mind sharing a little bit about them and where we can find them?
Yes. So my first one is, In Other Words, Quotes That Push Our Thinking. And that is through EduMatch Publishing. So it's available on Amazon or EduMatch publishing site. But it was actually, and I always think about like Sarah Thomas talking about like an idea. She had a shower gem, an idea. And one morning last summer, I thought, wonder about a book, because I write a ton of quotes because I read so much, and I've noticed that most of the notes I take away are often quotes. So I thought, I wonder about taking quotes and having them connect to education. But then as I got into writing it, I took the education piece out, because when I was reading what I had written, and then I had students and some other educators contribute, I realized like these are things that we could think about just in life, regardless of if you're an educator or not. So that book is, I mean, when you get the book and you hold it in your hand, you're like, oh my goodness, like,
yes,
great. But the best part of it has been sharing so many other stories that I've seen people come back and comment like, oh my gosh, I went through the same thing, or I wish I would have known this. So that's a great part of it too. And then the second one is The Future Is Now, Looking Back to Move Ahead. And that is through EduGladiators, also on Amazon and I think Barnes & Noble. And it's really just looking through different topics in education, like how we can grow ourselves personally, how we can, lead and help others to grow themselves, and how we can work together in planning for the future. So it kind of goes through a lot of different topics. There are some guest like vignettes in there. And I have a student who wrote an amazing chapter on failure. She actually just graduated high school this past year, but she wrote this, like, if you get the book, like read chapter 10, it is unbelievable. The fact that it was written by a high school senior, sharing her experience and what it means, the pressure of school and how you can rise above that. Remember, that you are not the failure. It's an event. It's something that happens. It's like, what do you do from that to grow? So those 2. And then the next one should be out in November, I think. We'll see.
Awesome. Congratulations. That's
Thank
wonderful.
you.
That's wonderful. And I'll make sure I'll link to the books and where we can find them in the show notes so people can learn more.
Thank you.
No problem. So what advice do you have? You shared a lot of great tidbits for pre-service teachers. Is there any other advice you'd like to share for my listeners?
Well, I gave you all those, like, I wish I knew this back then.
I knew that. Yeah.
I mean, I would say, don't be afraid to try something different. Like, even if you think, oh, well, I'm not going to be able to do that. Or, I mean, just as an example, doing presentations on augmented virtual reality, and you know this too, a lot of times teachers will say, well, I can't, it's too difficult, it's a challenge. Well, yeah, it can be, but there are so many resources out there. And the best example that we can set for students is by being, willing to take risks and push ourselves as well. And so don't be afraid to take those risks and see where it takes you, because you never know. You might be like me and say, I never really want to teach elementary school. And then you have this amazing experience and it completely changes, where you thought you were going. But never stop learning either. Like, take those chances. You might fail. I mean, how many failures we've all had? Oh my goodness.
Right.
Like on a daily basis, but they're still learning in that. And just always share that with students too.
I think that you brought up, going into different placements like elementary, middle school, high school, you never know where you're going to go. So find different places, find a variety of places to observe in, to do fields. And if you can, do student teaching in different places, different school districts, so you can get a feel for where your fit is. So whenever you're out job searching, you're not looking at places that you might be certified to teach, but maybe you're not qualified. You don't feel that is my calling, that is where I'm qualified to teach. Maybe you rock pre-K and that's where you want to be, so you're going to focus there. And so it's so important to find those variety of experiences during your college career. Rachelle, thank you so much for your time today. How can everyone find you online?
I'm very consistent with like my handle and email and all that stuff. So on Twitter, it's RDENE915. And then my blog site is that same, but it's just the www.com after the RDENE915. Instagram, same thing. I'm on Facebook, which it's not, but if you look me up, I'm in the different communities. I'm in your community on Facebook too, a couple of the same communities on Facebook. And then of course, email, you can probably guess what that is, at Gmail.
Yes. Awesome. And I'll pop all that in the show notes so the listeners can get in touch with you. Thank you so much for your time today. And just keep rocking it. Oh my gosh, I'm looking forward to reading your new book coming out in November. And thank you so much for today.
Thank you for having me on your show.
There you have it, EduMagicians. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and share it with your friends. For more EduMagic, check out sfessage.com and follow Dr. Sam on Twitter and Instagram @sfessage. Until next time, you have the EduMagic within you.